In the years 1914 to 1918, one of the world's deadliest total wars broke out in Europe. As Americans struggled to stay neutral, a turning point in history was just beginning. Prior to the war, the United States was largely populated by immigrants. Between the years 1900 and 1915, more than 15 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Of these groups, a large portion were from Germany and Britain. This detail would soon prove to cause a deep division of opinions. Also prior to the war, America had become the world's #1 industrial power. By the year 1900, the United States had one half of the world's manufacturing capacity. At the end of the century, it had overtaken Great Britain, both in iron, steel, and coal production. As America industrialized rapidly in the early 20th century, a large wave of urbanization hit. 40% of the U.S. population now lived in cities, such as New York and Chicago, with the rest remaining in rural small towns. America in the 20th century was thriving, with rapid technological advances and a strong economy. Because of this, our country chose to stay under the policy of isolationism, and mostly away from all foreign affairs. America had been under the policy of isolationism since the time of George Washington. In his 1796 farewell address, as seen above, George Washington said, and I quote, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." As America prospered, Europe wasn't so lucky. Weak military alliances dragged multiple countries into war. World War I officially began in August of 1914 between the European superpowers, Britain, France, and Russia, against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Each side had high nationalism, and they were all confident in their military powers. World War I expanded greatly over the next 3 years, eventually becoming a total war. The Allied powers grew into Great Britain, Belgium, France, Russia, and Italy, while the Central Powers were now made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. War waged on between the two powers, both sides fighting brutally and refusing to surrender. What was expected to be a short war extended over the next 4 years. As Europe's economy and land was devastated, American economy boomed during the start of the war. While remaining neutral under President Woodrow Wilson, our country sent over war items to the Allied powers, such as food and weapons. Due to our isolationism and divided sympathy, we were able to stay neutral for the beginning 3 years of this historically deadly war. This neutrality was largely thanks to President Wilson, who said the following quote in his Declaration of Neutrality: "Every man who truly loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is a spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned." Despite his efforts, this policy wasn't able to be withheld. America was strongly dragged into World War I by factors such as the sinking of American ships and the decoding of the Zimmerman telegram, which spoke of plans to take over America. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, and this was granted only 4 days later. For the first time in history, America relied on conscription. Officials also passed a Selective Service Act, which required men to serve in the military if they fit standards. Although mostly unexperienced, soldiers were eager to fight. Americans landed in Europe June of 1917, 3 years after the start of the war. They instantly provided the optimism and energy needed to push back the Central Powers and bring the Allies closer to victory. Back home in America, rapid changes were happening as well. Women and African Americans were needed to take on the work since such a large number of men were being sent overseas. This was a new sense of freedom for women, and their efforts were so great that President Wilson began to support the women's suffrage movement. A huge rise in central government was seen as well, and nearly every aspect of daily life, such as language and diet, was controlled by this new and controlling government in efforts to aid in the war. By the fall of 1918, over 2 million American troops had been sent to fight in Europe. Their presence broke the stalemate on the Western Front, forcing Germany and the rest of the Central Powers to call a truce. On November 11, 1918, World War I officially ended, but its effects are still seen today. Life after the war never recovered how things were before. As American soldiers were sent back home, they were often changed due to the violence they had faced, giving them the nickname the Lost Generation. It can be argued that World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which harshly accused Germany, led directly to the start of the Second World War. In this case of devastating European wars, America tried to remain neutral again, but it was clear that a lasting effect of the First World War had made this nearly impossible. By joining this war in Europe, America largely broke its longtime policy of isolationism. Leaders then struggled to try and isolate America from many foreign affairs such as World War II, but after 1914, it was clear there was no going back to the former ways. World War I introduced many new or advanced forms of weapons such as machine guns, mortars, and poison gas. The most advanced forms of transportation were also first used during World War I, such as tanks, submarines, and warplanes. The 1920s brought many new rights for women, largely based upon the fact that they took over male jobs during the war. They were now able to both work and vote. The American economy continued to prosper thanks to efforts made during the war. By 1929, for the first time in history, over half of the United States population lived in cities instead of small villages or farms. World War I was a devastating and deadly war that took over 100,000 American lives. It can be considered one of the most historically important turning points for America because it brought changes to nearly every aspect of our country, from the government and economy to new rights and pursuits.